Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Energy 101. You've got Sydney and Julie and a very special guest for a special episode. Today's a little different. With the news that has come out recently with ERCOT and the grid, a little bit of Bitcoin mining mixed in, we thought it would be fun to do a little special episode with our friend Marshall Long.
Yo, thanks for having me. Appreciate
Thanks for
y'all.
joining us. So give us the rundown on what's been all over Twitter.
All right. The grid is going down. It's been interesting because it's just so hot this summer across Texas at large. And there's a ton of renewables on the grid right now. And so interesting things happen when the sun stops shining and the wind stops blowing all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Sure does.
And when it's, 140 degrees outside and everybody comes home at the same time, turns on their AC. And also at the same time, the sun stops shining and the wind stops blowing. Yeah. Things go crazy. So
there's been a ton of headlines and a lot of people are angry, mostly at Bitcoin miners. They got paid so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure.
But can you kind of explain, you went on this long, let's call it a tweet storm. It wasn't really a tweet storm, but it was a very informative thread.
And can we link it?
Yeah, we're going to link it. We're going to actually put the pictures in the episode. So as we're talking through it, it's going to come up.
Cool.
But yeah, walk us through that because I don't think we've ever talked about the grid.
We haven't.
And Texas is very different than the rest of the U.S. and wherever else, and how our grid works and all of that. So
we'll just start, I guess, from the top.
Yeah. Our grid is just our grid.
That's right. So in general, the way any grid works is you link the generators to the end users, right? And so the best way to do that and the most efficient way to do that, those are all kinds of things that we'll be talking about. But that's how any grid works. Now, what makes Texas unique, and there are some others as well, is it's deregulated, meaning that there's a real market for supply and demand. So you can see a real-time market price. You have multiple retail electric providers, bidding on customers. You have different generation assets, and they're all privately owned. And the market is also privately owned. So ERCOT, while highly regulated by the Public Utility Commission, is still a private company. So that's very unique. There are some other ones like PJM is another one, and there are some others, but there are unique challenges to Texas. So it's not all of Texas, like El Paso is not in ERCOT.
I didn't know
that either.
Yeah, so there's you can just think of most of Texas being in ERCOT.
Right.
So when they say it's disconnected, the amount of what we call tie flows, what allows us to like import power, export power is very limited in Texas. So we're kind of like on an island. And ERCOT is split into a few groups. We call them load zones. So like Dallas is technically part of the same grid as Houston, but Dallas is in load zone north and Houston is its own thing. And we have load zone south and east and west, and they're all connected, but they're individual markets. So
makes sense.
Texas is its own kind of animal.
Individual markets in a sense of what?
Right. So if I go and I buy power, right, my power price is going to be, if I'm in Dallas, what the real-time market price for power in Dallas is going to be different every 5 minutes from it is in Houston.
Right.
It's pretty close, but it's technically a separate market.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think of whenever we had Gritty. Colin and I used
yeah.
Gritty.
Oh God, Gritty is such a great example.
What is that?
I loved Gritty up until, but let me preface this with we understood the risk.
Yeah, sure.
Like most people did not understand the risk. They thought they were just getting great prices.
Yeah.
Gritty was a provider, an electricity provider.
Yeah.
That gave you access to wholesale pricing. So we as end users got wholesale pricing, whereas usually wholesale pricing is what, the company like TXU Energy has, and then you get...
Then they give you the end user the pricing.
Right, and they like TXU will then kind of...
we can just start there. It's a great place to start. So when you buy power in Texas, you can only buy it from what we call a retail electric provider. So you can think of like a TXU or a Shell Energy or NG, whoever. It could be like a Tri-Eagle. That's a popular one in Houston. Those people are allowed to sell you power. And the way they generally do it is they go to the wholesale market. They go to ERCOT directly and they buy a chunk of power for, call it 5 years, right? So they'll go and they'll buy a chunk of power for 5 years, and then they'll mark that up and give you flat pricing for 5 years.
So they get a locked in price that's lower.
That's right.
So they can mark it
So
up.
the wholesale market is great. However, what Gritty did was they allowed customers, they basically passed through the cost to customers. And in ERCOT in general, the cost is cheaper, but the cost is also volatile, right? So the price kind of goes up and down and up and down. And in general, it's pretty low.
I would say really low. And there was times where we would have negative prices.
That's right.
Which we didn't get paid for, but we didn't have to pay.
Right. So that was their business model, right? Is they eat the negative pricing, they get that upside, and they're passing through the real-time market for you. And in general, you know, in the middle of the day when it's higher, you're not home anyway, you're not using power. So like Gritty's business model was, we'll basically pass through the real-time market, which is a really cool thing until a winter storm Uri comes.
Texas freeze.
So so that's called trading index. Okay. That's what we call trading index, where you're on the real-time market and you're buying real time. So it is a real-time marketplace. You can go to ERCOT's website. You can see the real-time market price. In order to do that, you have to post collateral with ERCOT. So Gritty puts up collateral with ERCOT, and that allows them with their rep license to do those kind of trades. Now, the problem is when prices explode from, you know, you're normally paying 3 cents, and then when Uri comes, you're actually paying $10 per kilowatt hour, which is insane.
It got really
People like can't pay that, right? Like you're paying $1,000 a day for your power, $2,000, $5,000. And if your customers can't pay, or you as a retail electric provider can also not pay ERCOT, and ERCOT does what's called a margin call. And they take all the collateral that they had with ERCOT and they get wiped out. They're bankrupt, they're toast, which means their customers. Then did you guys change to somebody else? How did that?
Yeah. So whenever it started happening, we were watching things and we were like, okay, we've got to do something.
I can't pay my power bill.
Gritty's just like sending out emails like, find a new provider. This is not good. Grab a blanket, find a new provider. So at that time, other providers, you couldn't get in. Like they were so overwhelmed with trying to figure out what to do for themselves, I think.
That's right.
That it was really hard to find one. So we eventually found one and we switched. So we were kind of hedged from that for the most part. I mean, it still got up to, I don't even know if we paid. I doubt we paid.
Yeah.
But it got up pretty high.
Yeah,
which was
crazy.
You sit there and watch the app and you're just watching the app real time and you're like, turn everything off.
Throw the breakers at the house. Yeah.
Not that even like we didn't even have electricity at this time. Or I guess it started a few days before the storm.
That's right. Yeah. So the prices started to explode, I think, Friday night or Saturday. And then the storm was like Sunday night. So
So for the most part, like if you didn't switch, your electricity was out anyway.
Yeah.
But some bills were insane.
Yeah, so that's the double-edged sword of a real-time market, right? So most large suppliers, they don't do that because it's a risk mitigation strategy, right? So in ERCOT, there are a few key players that we'll call. So you got the retail electric providers. You've got brokers who help people shop, right? So you can go to like thepowertochoose.com or like scannandquote.com. Those are all good examples. You can like upload your power bill. So like on scannandquote.com, you upload your power bill and they'll do the shopping for you between all the reps. And they have deals with the reps where they'll mark up the power slightly, but they get you a good price, right? Because everybody has different prices and it's illegal for reps to call each other and say, hey, what's your price today? What's your price today? So it's the brokers are kind of in there. They make a little bit of a spread. They mark your power up, but you get a pretty competitive price. Those are like the main two entities. Now, as far as the more nuanced things, like the demand response and all these winter storms that we'll get into, there's what's called a QSE, call it a QESE. I think it stands for Qualified Scheduling Entity. And that's kind of like the third leg. That's more of the bespoke things. So in general, those are the main three types of people that are dealing with the power market. And there's all kinds of other things like traders and all those other things. But as far as you're at home, you pay a power bill, you're paying your power bill to a rep. Now, who found you that deal? That's probably a broker
Mm-hmm.
like Savant Energy or, a ton of these other brokers out there. And then for other things, like Tesla has a new thing right now. If you have power walls or solar panels, they'll help you sell to the real-time market.
Oh, cool.
So Tesla is a rep when they sell you the power, but when they're trading the power for you, they're a QSE.
Okay.
So most of these large reps are also a QSE. So that's kind of where this whole thing gets involved because, you've got people saying, oh, ERCOT paid Bitcoin miners $30 million on the back of the taxpayers, and that's not actually the whole truth.
Yeah.
So
yeah, let's dive into that. And I'm gonna say this from someone who is I'm not super uneducated, but I'm not knowledgeable either. Like it's like I could go either way. So looking at Twitter and seeing, the outrage and people are basically saying like, why are Bitcoin miners even on in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're wasting energy, whatever. I can see a stance for that. And if I weren't like for freedom, I could see how that would be confusing to just
general
your
population.
layman. Yeah. Like how it would be confusing. Like, why are they getting paid to not use it? It's just confusing.
Yeah.
And I want to clear it up.
Oh, yeah.
Because there is a lot more education that goes into that.
Totally.
Yeah.
So in general, the fact that you come home and you turn on a light and it works is a miracle of modern science. The grid is a crazy thing. So let me kind of break things down first, and then we'll get into why Bitcoin miners are important. And not just Bitcoin miners, but large flexible loads. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when you turn on your light and it works, it's because the grid is operating smoothly. Mm-hmm. The question is, well, how does the grid operate smoothly? When the generators and the consumers are in unison, things work great. So here's what happens when a gas turbine turns on. If there's no load on that turbine, it will spin much faster than it should. Now, when a turbine spins too fast, you've all heard of a frequency, right? We know that in the States, we use 60 hertz. So when you look on like the back of an iPhone charger, it'll say 50 to 60 hertz. It's because 50 hertz is in Canada and other places. But in the States, we use 60 hertz. That means the turbine itself across the grids, all the turbines are spinning. They like to spin at 60 hertz. But when you put a load on that turbine, it will slow down. When you pull a load off that turbine, it will speed up.
And so what do you mean by load?
So when everybody comes home and they turn on their lights at the same time, that's pulling a load.
Got it.
So when you pull more electricity on a turbine, on a gen set of some kind, it will make it spin slower. That's just a property of the physical reality. So if you just think that there's a turbine linked to your house light switch, when you flip on the switch, it spins slower. When you turn it off, it spins faster.
Got it.
And so that's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's and so when it spins slower, it's no longer producing energy at 60 hertz. So if you look at one of these slides here, this shows you on a normal day the frequency of the grid. So you can see it's not a flat line. It bounces between 60.025 hertz and 59.975 hertz. This is a normal day. Everything's going well, but it's not a straight line. Now, the reason that it's not a straight line is because nobody's using the same amount of power and nobody's using one turbine, right? It's not one turbine that powers the entire grid. So this is all the generators communicating, and this is all the flexible loads communicating. So the fact that it's pretty range bound quite tightly is a good thing. And above that, you can see why it's range bound so quickly. So these are the things that we call ancillary services. So these are all the generators and all the generators, natural gas, wind, solar, batteries, and all the consumers who are enrolled in ancillary services working together nicely. So it seems kind of like a chaotic graph, but it's really not the way things are supposed to work.
Yeah.
Now, when things dip below certain thresholds, these ancillary services will be triggered. So you can see the reg up chart and the reg down chart. Those are the most, I would say, used ancillary services.
What is reg up and reg down?
Ancillary services, there's a few buckets, okay? And so reg up and reg down are mostly used by generators communicating between themselves. So if a bunch of people come home at one time, or one generator has a big problem, like let's say the nuclear power plant Comanche Peak. Let's say I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, they had a fire on one of their transformers. And just like that, 1.3 gigawatts fell off the grid, right? So all the other turbines started having problems. And so they communicate, and some will spin faster and some will spin slower. And maybe some windmills will get cut off, or, brakes will be pulled off some so they can generate more. All those lines, those purple lines, kind of show you how those assets are communicating collectively.
So it's all kind of a formula
That's
depending on what needs to happen. They all work together.
That's right.
To find just the best formula.
If you want to generate on ERCOT, you can't just like connect to the grid.
Right.
You talk to ERCOT.
Yeah.
And most of these power plants, these huge power plants, there's like 5 people that work there. They're highly automated, highly orchestrated, very unified across ERCOT telemetry. So they all kind of talk. And that's what kind of keeps the grid in those bounds. Now, what happens when they get out of bounds? The other ancillary services can get dispatched. So if you go to the next one, here's a good example. You see how the frequency dipped. This was from last week. That big dip down to 59.8. That's a big red flag. So now you see how the rest of the charts kind of are way more, the purple lines are way more different. When the grid goes that low, it's danger time. So if you want to go to the first picture, we'll look at what happened during the Winter Storm Uri. So this kind of explains what happened, and this is a chart of frequency. So a lot of people want to talk about how much power the grid uses and how much power the grid has available, but that's not really the most important part. The most important part is frequency, to make sure everything is kind of in lockstep. So look, if the frequency like nosedive to like 40 hertz, all your electronics in your house are getting fried.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah. So fried. And the breakers aren't going to trip in your house. So like frequency is the most important part. Some people say it's like the blood of the grid. The grid is like the veins. The amount of blood you have is like the capacity, but the actual movement of the blood within your body is super important.
Yeah.
Right? You can bleed out a little bit and you're fine. But if your blood stops moving at the right pace, you've got big problems.
Yeah.
So this is kind of similar. So for the winter storm, you can see how this is kind of, it starts off as like not a crazy slope, and then it nosedives. So what happens is when winter storms happen, right, and the turbines weren't winterized. I know everybody's heard, the winterization, blah, blah, blah. When things freeze and the turbines stop spinning, what happens is other turbines stop spinning because those turbines stop. And then it's kind of like a falling knife that you have to catch. And so when all the turbines start tripping each other off because this one froze, okay, and now this turbine has more load on it because it's taking more load.
Gotcha.
It takes more from the rest of them. It spins slower. And then because it's spinning slower, the frequency keeps going down. And then the next turbine is slower because it's having to soak more load.
Right.
And so you can see how it just kind of progressively nosedives. And so you've got, at the first point, you've got 1.4 gigawatt of outages. And then you can see another 250 and another 330. So what the grid has to do is they have to shed the load. So when a turbine falls offline, the other turbine spins slower because they're having to eat more of the consumption, which makes that spin slower, which trips others offline, and so on and so forth. So you've got to have these rolling blackouts to pull the load off. And so if you can't get in front of it, you can see how it goes down. The winter storm went down very low, 59.3, which sounds like nothing.
Not that much.
Yeah, but big problems can happen if, you don't want to hurt people, number one. You can have very serious electrical equipment failures. And so they open the relays to disconnect people.
Yeah.
And so you can see the little sag there, the red line is, we were, I think when the grid gets to 59.25, the whole thing just shuts down.
Oh, good.
And so that would be called a total grid blackout.
what would have happened? Like, how long does it take to come back on after
Sure.
that?
So there are
That's terrifying.
protocols.
we were very close.
Yes. So if everything goes offline, like hospitals and
right.
Yeah.
Because they kept the hospitals on.
So they
during
kept
that
the
time.
hospitals on. There's also certain
yeah.
non-interruptible loads. Like there's a lot of like refineries that have catalysts they have to keep hot.
Yeah.
Because it will cost billions of dollars if their whole pipeline gets backed up.
Yeah.
And that can be bigger problems. So, but let's say we did have a full grid blackout. Hospitals are off. Police stations are off. Fire departments are off. You can't use your phone. Cell phone towers
It honestly
are off.
sounds like the purge.
It is the purge.
It gives me the chills.
Make no mistake.
About it.
If you have a grid blackout,
people are dying.
For real, and it's super cold, like beyond just people in their houses, you've got people in hospitals, on like defibrillators, and like all that's gone, right? So there are procedures in place to do what's called a black start. That's where you have to open everything up, and you basically say, okay, generator 1, turn on, and then we light up this section of the grid. Okay, they're good. Now we go to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So it's, I think the current protocol is 4 hours if everything goes perfectly. Generally, that doesn't happen.
Right.
We haven't had a black start in a very long time, but it could be like 4 hours to like a week of just like issues. So,
yikes.
You can think of frequency getting away from you like a ripple effect. You drop a big stone in a pond, and it just propagates throughout the whole grid. So that's why this is an exact chart of what happened for Uri. And as things start coming back up, there's even more problems. So anyway, this is why frequency is super important. So in the summer, when people are using more power,
right.
There's going to be issues like this. So this is from September 7th. You can see so this is a chart from ERCOT, and the blue line is the projected use. The blue dotted line is the projected use of the grid. And the purple line is the projected capacity of the grid.
Oh, good.
So when the blue line goes over the purple line, not great.
So are these charts, not that the normal human could read them and like know what you're looking at, but can anyone go on ERCOT's website
That's right.
and like find these?
That's right. These are all publicly available. You can go to ERCOT.com, and they've got one called Grid Dashboard. You just click that. That's where you're going to find these charts. There's links to it as well in this tweet. So
we had some issues.
That's right. And so this was, I took the screenshot at I think around 9:00 in the morning, but ERCOT has a forecast for the day. So they know that things are going to be tight. And so this is where the flexible loads on the other side come into play. So they're going to tell all the generators, hey, you guys need to be running full bore. Please don't try to do maintenance today. You need to be running balls out.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put the loads on notice. If you're registered in the ancillary services programs, you're probably going to get dispatched today. Now that means ERCOT's going to call you and they're going to tell you, we need you to turn off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're enrolled in these programs, you get paid if you get turned off. So the way these programs work is if you're a large flexible load and you are enrolled in ancillary services.
What are some examples of
Sure.
who would be a large flexible load?
There's tiers of large flexible loads. So like an aluminum smelter plant, okay? They can turn off. They're a big load, but they might need like 2 hours to turn off, okay? So they could be a registered ancillary services.
Mm-hmm.
Another example would be like a Bitcoin mine.
Right.
They can turn off much quicker, and they're usually much larger. A battery, like a industrial sized battery would be one. A big warehouse could be one. But they're all in this kind of like stacked order, right? So if you tell ERCOT, hey, we use a lot of power and we'd love to enroll in ancillary services, they'll say, great, how quickly can you turn off and how quickly can you turn on? So for like an aluminum smelter, they'll say, we can turn off in 2 hours and it's going to take us 2 hours to come back up. They say, okay, cool. We're going to put you in what we call ERS, Emergency Response Services. So that's generally the lowest tier. They give them, I think, 30 minutes to turn off. And when you turn back on, isn't that important? So that's like bottom of the barrel. If you're enrolled in ancillary services or demand response, that's like bottom of the barrel. If you can turn off your whole load in 30 minutes, cool. We'll pay you. We're not going to pay you a lot, and you can tell us when you think it's okay to turn off as far as market pricing goes. So the ancillary services also have their own prices. So I tell ERCOT, I'm going to run until your ancillary service is going to pay me X amount.
Oh.
So it's not you just tell me when to turn off. I'll tell you, if you're going to pay me X amount, I'll turn off.
Well, and that makes sense because I feel like, especially for some commercial industrial people,
they've got real opportunity cost.
And so it's not worth it for them until that payment gets to a certain level.
That's right.
Can consumers, just like myself or Julie, be a part of that?
There are things you have to do. So there's capacity limits that you would need to. They don't just let 50 kilowatts of a house be on this program. I think the minimum is 1 megawatt.
Okay. Well, I'm sure.
But there's a lot of warehouses and, like shops and heavy machinery people that like they do this.
Well, because I figured most households aren't going to move the needle.
That's right. At
all. Yeah.
So that's like the bottom tier demand response. Now above that, you've got things called non-spin, which is another, you have 30 minutes to turn off, but you have to come back on in 30 minutes as well. And there's another one called ECRS, which is 5 minutes. You have to turn off within 5 minutes and come back on in 5 minutes. And those are all great, but a turbine reacts within milliseconds, right? So there's a top tier called CLR that you, in order to qualify for CLR, you have to be able to respond to an ERCOT request within 4 seconds.
Who does the company just give ERCOT like an emergency line? Like they literally just pick up the phone and call.
4 seconds is fast to react.
Yeah. And they called Tim at so-and-so and they're like, hey, Tim, turn it off.
This is where the QSEs come into play. So the QSE, ERCOT is not telling me at my warehouse,
got it.
Hey, you've been dispatched for ERS, turn off in 30 minutes, please. It's ERCOT telling my QSE through an API.
Okay.
And then the QSE has an automated email, text, and phone.
Got it.
An example of a QSE would be like Voltus Power, right? So they have an automated dispatch. They'll call you, and it's like an automated teleprompt, like, hey, you've been dispatched for ERS, turn off. So that's all done through the QSEs. The higher tier stuff is a little bit more connected. So most large consumers have what's called telemetry. It's analog data communication with ERCOT. So ERCOT can see my load in real time, and I can respond to their request in real time through my QSE.
Got it.
So my QSE will say, it's all automated through APIs and telemetry calls, but I tell ERCOT every 1 minute, I'm using this much power. Let me know if you need me. Now for the 4-second CLR stuff, that's all. ERCOT will basically give me a graph, and they'll say, here's a slope you need to follow, and I'm going to update this slope every 4 seconds, and you have to be on that line. So they'll tell me how I ramp and how I ramp up and down and up and down. It's not just all or nothing.
Why is it important to ramp up and down and not just like turn off?
Because if I can stay in lockstep with the generators going up and down, I want to be polar opposite with the generators. So if they're spinning too fast, I want to use more power. If they're spinning too slow, I want to use less power. And so if I can do that, I can help the generators stay in that 60 hertz sweet spot.
That's why it's so important, the 60 hertz.
That's right.
Keeping.
That's right.
I see. Okay.
So that's like the top tier demand response ancillary services, the CLR stuff. Now, beyond that, there's a new program called FFR, which you have to respond within 250 milliseconds. And that's mostly just batteries.
Okay.
So the batteries, they'll tell batteries, hey, we need you to eat more or discharge more. So that's kind of like
all automated, right? Like
mostly, sometimes you have
it's
problems.
Not a person.
No, it's all software based.
Got it. Okay.
And there's but there is a 3-strike rule kind of in ERCOT. If they call you and they tell you to turn off and you don't turn off, 3 strikes, you are banned for life.
Wow.
You cannot participate. Because,
and I'm sure they give you like heads up, so you're watching it.
Well, in order to be in the top tier programs, you have to test. They test you. So they'll say, okay, your load test for this program is going to be this day next week, and it's going to be between these hours. And if you fail that test, you cannot be enrolled in that program.
Wow.
So those high tier programs, they pay more and they pay more often, right? So ERS, I think, has been dispatched like 3 times this year. September 7th is a good example of that. Or maybe the 6th, I'm not sure. But CLR, I mean, we get dispatched multiple times a day.
Mm-hmm.
So to put it in perspective, why Bitcoin miners specifically are well suited, the CLR program's been in ERCOT as like a published program for I think 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's been able to pass the qualification test except for the past like 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Interesting.
So ERCOT's very good at like making these buckets. Like, hey, we have a need. You could fill this need if you can match these criteria in this test. And that test has been out there for almost a decade.
So they had no one for like
nobody,
4 years.
Because no load can respond as quickly as a Bitcoin mine. So a Bitcoin mine is a big user, but it's also a granular user.
Yeah.
So you might use 100 megawatts, but those 100 megawatts are broken into chunks of 3,000 watts. So 3 kilowatts here, 3 kilowatts here, 3 kilowatts here. And most Bitcoin miners can control their miners independently of each other. And so if ERCOT says, hey, we need you to use 99.91 megawatts, cool.
They're like,
do
cool,
it.
no problem.
Yeah, just turn off 10 machines.
Yeah.
Good to go.
So
right?
this happened and the outrage came because people found out
Sure.
that
So
some Bitcoin miners were getting paid.
So there's two sides to this like getting paid story. If you look at your power bill, there's a bunch of line items on there. There's like nuclear decommissioning. There's, ancillary service providing. There's all kinds of little small line items that if you look at your actual power bill in great detail, they're all there.
Yeah.
And those are things you pay for so that when you turn on the light, they come on.
Yeah.
So because Comanche Peak has to dispose of spent fuel rods, you got to pay a little bit for that. But you want Comanche Peak online because it's a stable, sustainable provider of power, right? And just for the ancillaries as well, you have to pay for ancillary services. So when the frequency drops, you can still blast your AC at 60 degrees.
Right.
Those are all part of the ancillary things. And ERCOT takes that payment from you. Well, your rep takes that payment from you. They send that to ERCOT, and ERCOT pays the people who helped make sure you could turn on your AC when you wanted to.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. So... And at certain months, those ancillaries are higher. And certain months, they're zero. So like in the fall, if you look at your bill compared to the summer, your ancillary charges will be much less.
Yeah.
Much, much less. Your rep kind of normalizes that for you, but depending on what your power contract is, you will see those line items.
Right.
I want to pull up my bill now.
I know. Now I want to know.
My bill's been very high, so I'm curious.
Lucas likes to leave the freaking door open for the dogs. And I'm like, the air's on. The door is open. We can't turn the air off because it's going to be 80 degrees. I'm going to kill him one of these days.
That's right. And those ancillary charges ensure that your AC stays on. So that's the first way.
He is single-handedly.
We appreciate him. We appreciate him.
I'm sure we do.
So that's one side is people get paid for ancillary services and what they contributed to help the grid. Now the bigger chunk of that pie is selling the power back to the grid. So as a large user, I'm not buying power the way households buy power. I buy power the more similar to the way a rep would buy power. I go to the market with the help of a rep and I prepay for a chunk of power. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's technically like a futures market, but just suffice to say, I'm buying a chunk of power and I'm prepaying for 5, 10, 20 years. And because
a lot of money.
That's right. Because I pre-bought that power, I locked in my price.
Right.
Now in the fall, the price might be less, but in the summer, I'm not paying $5,000 a megawatt hour. Right. But because I prepaid for that, I own it. Now, when the price of power explodes past what I paid for it plus what I'm making with it, I can choose to sell that power back to the real-time market. Now,
so
that's
you can
not.
Make money
I can make money by selling the power and not using it. Now, that has nothing to do with ancillary services.
Is that like
that's just
PPAs?
like,
yes. So if
that's
I
just
have a
extra
long-term
power.
hedge PPA,
Okay.
and the price of power explodes, so there's a price chart on one of these.
This is so interesting. Like, I feel like I never would have thought, like,
Yeah, it's very
it makes
nuanced.
sense when you think
One more
about
down.
it, but
Keep
there's a
going down.
lot that goes into power.
Keep going down. So you can see right now the real-time price of power. If you hover over that spike, it's 80. I think it's 80.
That's like right now.
Yeah, that's right now. So $64.
$64.
Let's say I bought power for 5 years and I paid $20.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say whatever I'm doing, if I'm a refinery and I'm making $50 equivalent doing my business, maybe you'd want to turn off and sell your power back because you're actually making more selling the power than you are using it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other side of that, it's a real-time market. That's not ERCOT paying me. There's a counterparty that bought. So if I place that sell on the market to sell my power, there's a counterparty who's going to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
because it's an actual futures contract, there's somebody who's always long power and somebody who's always short power. So when prices explode to $5,000, I can sell my power at that price, and there's somebody who's going to buy it at that price. That's not ERCOT and taxpayers paying that to me. So to put it in perspective, I think Riot, they do a great job of doing demand response. And there was kind of a hit piece put out by CNBC. It's like, ERCOT and taxpayers paid ERCOT $31 million, which is not true. That's it. Again, there's two chunks. There's ancillary services, which is what taxpayers take the burden on so that the grid works. And there's selling power. I think ERCOT only paid them about $7 million. The rest of that was them opportunistically selling their power to the market. And that's usually like a bank or a generator or somebody that's net short power that has to buy that. And so if you have a PPA, you're long power. So that's just kind of how it works. So really, most of the money being made by miners is us just selling our PPAs back to the market.
Right.
Ancillaries is super necessary for reasons we said, but it's usually makes up only revenue for us in the summer or in the winter when things are going crazy.
So how much did Riot actually make from ancillary services?
I think they published it's about $7 million.
Okay, so that was
not
total
7 of 32 million.
The 32 million.
Yeah, the remainder, the net of that was them just selling power
PPA,
in the real-time market.
Okay.
Yeah, which does not come from taxpayers.
That's what I find so frustrating. It's just all of these, like, it's just, are they uninformed or do they just want to?
It's the reality is the grid is an insanely complex thing. And, you know, I'm not an expert by any means. And there are so many more niche places, just like oil and gas stuff, right? Like, I kind of know how oil comes out of the ground, but like, just like 6 months ago, I know what the word bitumen is. I didn't even know what that word was.
I don't know
what that means.
Yeah, apparently it's like when oil comes out of the ground, it's not like black oil. It's like a mix of crap.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
They probably use certain chemicals from our chemical friend.
Yeah.
Kai.
There you go. So again, I also have no idea about that. So the grid is incredibly complicated and it's always changing. There's new programs coming out by ERCOT and there's new regulations and this and that and the third. So it's always changing. But I don't think in general it's a mistake that they try to paint people of large users as like bad.
For sure.
Right. So I also put a tweet up about why it's important to have large flexible loads. Yeah. So that right there is a good one to kind of highlight. That's something that this guy Pierre from Riot put out that talks a lot about more in detail about ancillary services. You guys should probably link this one here.
Yeah.
Did a good job of like breaking that one down. That chart is a good kind of indicator of when things, you can kind of tell when things are going to go haywire. So this is a chart of wind and solar on ERCOT. And as you can see on this day, they both dropped off at the same time. And so when generation drops off, but consumption stays constant or goes up, you're going to have frequency problems. And it's just hard to tell when the wind's going to blow and when the sun's going to go off exactly. Right. So this is why Texas has to have a robust ancillary services program because we do have so much renewables on the grid.
I'm laughing at your the caption. ERCOT gets to live another day.
That's right. Yeah, I put a and that actually this day was good because the wind actually kicked up when it was projected to not kick up, and so ERCOT did not crap the bed this day. So anyway, that's a good overview, I think, and let's blow holes in it.
Yeah. No, I mostly want to kind of combat like people on Twitter who say ERCOT should be spending that $7 million that they use in ancillary, which it sounds stupid now that I know like all the information behind it, but they should be working on, what do they say, like new equipment or new ways to generate power rather than paying people.
So again, keep in mind that ERCOT is a private company.
They can do
all the generators are private companies.
They can do whatever they want.
And the people who buy power are all doing it at will. Now, what does that mean for the consumer? That means that your power price is cheap, right? So right now, maybe you pay 11 cents per kilowatt hour, 12 cents, something like that. When I lived in Boston, I was paying 30 cents.
Oh my gosh.
And it's not because there's not enough power. It's just because it's all done by one company and there's no competition. So you got to pay a little bit.
Capitalism for the win.
Yeah.
That's right. You got to pay a little bit in fees to make sure that the capitalism is allowed to do its thing.
Yeah.
But you, at the end of the day, reap the benefit of having lower prices.
Yeah.
Now, 11, 12 cents right now is crazy high to me.
Yeah.
Right? It was 5, 6 cents. But with all the storms and all the ancillary stuff's getting dispatched, it's gone up.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still not 30, 40 cents that you're going to pay in New England, New York, all these kinds of regulated markets.
I guess that's my next question is the regulated markets. They have one person. It's more of like a government oversight rather, so they can charge what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And
it sucks.
It's wild to me that doesn't get more talked about. And people always talk about how the winter storm, how they like blame it on the oil companies or like whatever, just like manipulating the market and all of that. And I actually saw something in the Houston Chronicle of all places about this where they're like blaming I don't know if it was oil companies or whatever, pipeline, something. They're blaming the freeze on that. And it makes me sad that people like don't care to educate themselves. They just believe that. And they're like, go after these.
Well,
they should all be arrested, blah, blah, blah.
It's just easier.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there are, in these regulated markets, there is oversight. They're not going to like be allowed to just completely gouge you because then the federal government will get involved. But they are allowed to kind of warrant their prices for things that they see fit to do. Right. So for instance, they might want to overwinterize, right? They're going to pass that cost along to you because it's all the generation in most of these places is one company, right? So like Duke Energy, for example, they run a good portion of the grid around like Ohio and some of those places. They want to overwinterize their stuff, good or bad, however you see it, doesn't matter. You got to pay for it, but you didn't get to say, yes, I opt in for that or not. In Texas, because there's multiple generation companies, some might winterize differently or at different times. And so you also don't get to choose that, but it's not an all or nothing situation. Right. So you have the fees that you're paying for ancillary services. I think the way you put it's pretty good. It's like an insurance policy.
Yeah.
Very rarely does that insurance policy get called, but it does get called, right? So like this summer is a good example of that. The winter storm, good example of that. And they're baking in that price into their power, right? But you don't have to buy power from NG, you don't have to buy it from Shell. You can buy it from whoever, and they all compete to get your business. So as time goes on, and you're seeing more people put solar panels on their houses and, all these other ways to kind of like curb their power usage or power reliance is maybe a better word. You can't do that in other markets.
Yeah.
If you want to put solar panels on your house in Puerto Rico, you cannot.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Like there's not allowed.
There is a regulation for Puerto Rico specifically, and maybe other places in the States, that if you put solar panels on your house, you still have to pay for what you use because they see it as stealing money from the power company. Because there's one power company. Now, there's other places like this inside of Texas that we call co-ops, right? So like Austin is a good example of this. Austin, as far as ERCOT is concerned, is 1 meter. And everybody inside of Austin is inside this co-op. Now, what they can do as the co-op owner is they can enroll in demand response programs. You don't get any of that upside. The co-op owners get that upside. So there are regulated markets inside of ERCOT, and there are deregulated markets inside of ERCOT.
Okay.
So just to kind of make that distinction.
Yeah.
Has Texas always had its own grid?
I think so. Yeah.
My brain is thinking like grid history, like especially with ERCOT being a private company. Who started ERCOT? Like,
yeah.
Could you imagine being like, I started ERCOT? Like, wow.
Yeah. So I'm not super familiar on like the history of ERCOT.
I will be Googling.
But I do know that there's a rule book that they have to play by.
Yeah.
By the PUC. So the Utility Commission kind of like, there's a set of rules that they have to abide by. And
there's,
the Railroad Commission, all that kind of stuff. So
what would you, if you were in like the CEO of ERCOT, would you change anything in the way anything is done? That's such a good question.
They actually do a really good job. They frequently meet with large loads. There's the Texas Large Flexible Task Force. Large Load Flexible, I forget the name of it, but it's an initiative that was started by the Texas Blockchain Association. ERCOT meets with these people monthly, and they say, you guys doing good at this, bad at this. We could get more help here. If you do XYZ differently, it would help us. So they're in large loads are in constant communication with ERCOT. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So for people that are reading some of these headlines, and especially after the winter storm, and people that don't understand what it would be like to be a part of, if Texas didn't have their own grid and we were a part of just the U.S. grid system, what would that look like?
Good question. It's a give and take, right?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have had a big problem in the storm. That's for sure. Because we've been able to import more power at places that weren't having that kind of storm, right? So
because we only use the power that's
generated here.
And all of Texas was
So we would have been able to pull
right.
from other okay.
So we do have some that we can pull from Mexico. We do have some that we can pull from, I think, New Mexico and a couple of other places, but it's de minimis. So that is one upside. If we were connected, we had more tie flows, we could have been just fine. So like El Paso, no problem. They were cool. No problem. They had power. It was fine. However, you're going to end up paying more for your power because of that. So it's kind of a give and take. What do you want? Do you want extreme reliability or do you want extremely competitive pricing? You cannot have both.
Yeah.
So, the truth is probably a balancing act somewhere in there.
For sure.
And the way ERCOT does that is with the ancillary services. So their balancing act is we're still self-reliant. We're still going to, if we can make our loads communicate with our generators, then we'll be fine. And that is true. So that's where these ancillary markets come in.
And okay, my last question, and then we can wrap it up. A bunch of energy people were getting, I don't know if upset is the right word, but they were just on Twitter as well, talking about the Bitcoin miners. Can you explain why it's important for Bitcoin miners? And I think you kind of already answered this with the Hertz. I think that was the perfect explanation. But why it's important for Bitcoin miners to really ramp up in the middle of the day when load is less?
Sure. I'm going to actually pull up that tweet because I think I answered it a little bit more eloquently and well thought out than I will just
right now.
Bumping my gums right now. Because I get that question a lot, and I also get the if miners weren't here in the first place, we wouldn't have these problems.
Which isn't true.
Yeah, so let's just start there. If I get that one the most, if miners weren't even allowed, that we wouldn't have this problem. Here's the reality: you will still have those problems. And I linked a graph where, in a news article, I think from 2017, maybe 2018, I don't remember, where a Comanche Peak fire happened and 1.3 gigawatts fell offline and the frequency of the grid nosedived because it was like an unplanned thing, right? And that happens a lot. Not a lot, but sometimes.
Often enough.
Yeah, sure. And that was when there was almost no mining in Texas and the frequency took a huge nosedive and it was in the middle of the day and the ancillary services responded. Now, they responded very quickly. Do they respond
to pick their load up as well? It's not just down.
That's
it's
right.
not just
so that's
power
why
down.
You saw reg up and reg down.
Got it. Okay.
So depending on what your asset is, right? Can you do both? Maybe, maybe not. So like Bitcoin miners, they can use more if they want to overclock their machines, right? Or they can use less by turning off. So it depends on your asset. So the grid issues happen whether or not there's miners involved, right? And depending on which demand response program ancillary service you're in, depends on how much you're able to help. Not all miners can turn off quickly.
Right.
A lot of software is involved, a lot of technical know-how, a lot of operational expertise goes into that. Right. So the large miners, they can do that very well. Smaller, maybe mid-sized miners, they can't because they don't have the custom software to do that. So in general, some of the miners weren't even on when all these problems were happening. So whether or not miners are here or not doesn't mean that the grid's going to have less frequency issues. But the fact that they're here and they're very flexible allows the grid to kind of self-heal itself quickly. What was your other question?
Why is it important for miners to turn on during the day?
During the day when load is less.
Sure. So when load is less?
Well, during the day when no one's using as much power.
Sure. So let's talk about the weekends versus during the week.
Okay.
Because you go to work and this room probably uses more power than like a room in your house, right?
Yeah.
So during the day, during the week, middle of the day, that's when load peaks generally.
Okay.
Also so that's called the super peak. And then when everybody comes home and turns on their AC, that's another smaller peak.
Okay.
So, but because there's so much renewables, when the load is the secondary peak, the sun's not shining anymore, right? But it's still hot. So people want to, turn on their TVs and, run their, so giving large load back to the grid at that time, which is what miners would generally do when the secondary price spike happens or a secondary dispatch happens because of frequency problems, because they can turn off and on so quickly at a moment's notice, quite literally a moment's notice, that allows the grid to just work well. Because it's not getting cooler. Everybody knows that. It's just getting hotter. And there's more people and there's more houses and there's just more and more and more of everything. Yeah. Generators can't come online that fast. But if more loads can turn off quicker, then it gives the generation time to kind of catch up.
Right.
So, because building a huge natural gas power plant, I mean, it's a very serious process, and it's not going to happen in a year. So
yeah, we actually talked about that with Lisa. Do you remember? Just talking about how she was talking about how if you kind of compare a natural gas power plant with a Bitcoin miner, and I think she was talking in terms of this, which I think back then went over our head because we asked each other after, we were like, "Did you understand what she was talking about?" No.
We didn't.
If you get in a room with these walking brains for power, a lot of it, I've had to sit down. So I've only learned this stuff for the past 4 or 5 years, and it's by going to lunch with people like that. You're just all right, please. Tell me.
Everything.
Okay, one more time because I have no idea what you just said. Again,
one more time, but dumb it down.
Yeah.
So a lot of those things I think is why the education is important, and it's just really complicated stuff because it's so nuanced, and you can go to any power company and there's going to be an expert for everything, but that expert probably doesn't know what the next expert sitting next to him knows.
Right. Yep. That's what we always talk about in energy in general. Most people. No, everyone doesn't know all the different parts. There's so much to it. It's so complex that's
why I love watching y'all's Twitter too, because there's so much ONG stuff that I'm like, what is going on?
Yeah.
I Colin will tweet something there's CO2 being blown off. I'm like, dude, this looks like a Mad Max movie. What is going on? He's like, oh, it's just a normal day. And I'm like, what? So, I mean, it's the energy game is super.
It's a wild
nuanced.
Place to be.
It's nuts. And I'm slowly trying to learn more, but
well, you can learn more by listening to Energy 101.
There you go.
Awesome. I think, did you have anything else that you wanted to explain or anything? Okay, I think this was
great.
Good. Yeah, I love this. I honestly, I like whenever we have new topics that light bulbs go off and I can go back into other conversations and put things together. So this is really, really good. I think it'll be helpful for a lot of people.
Especially being in the summer. And I feel like you said in the beginning, it's kind of a hot topic. There's a lot of headlines coming out. So.
A lot of people that aren't in the industry at all.
Yeah.
I had a friend from jiu-jitsu send it to us and they're like, what? What's going on?
You guys are the devil.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm not an expert.
If you work in oil and gas, you're already the devil. So
that's right.
Get in line, everyone.
And this is a learning thing. So, sometimes I'll misspeak or say something wrong. I love it too. I think I said LMP was live market price, and it's location marginal price as part of the real-time market. And someone's like, oh, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
You're wrong about everything.
You're right. I don't know. That's why we're talking and discussing. I know some things. I don't know everything. And so it's it's good. Having these learning things, I think is super important.
Yeah, it is. Just continuing education and I think opening your brain and just be open to learning about stuff that you're reading, so you actually understand it and can discern what is true and what is not so true. Is something I feel more people
in general with the mass media. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere,
just take.
It's just buried under layers of bullshit.
Facts.
Clickbait. Yeah. Do we want to do the 3 questions?
I feel we should do 2 because I feel recently
two.
The first 2 are kind of the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Rapid fire.
Lay it on me.
Number 1 / number 2 because we're combining them. What is the biggest?
Let's do Bitcoin mining.
That's a good one. Misconception about Bitcoin mining. We usually say about energy, but I think we can get a little more specific.
Biggest misconception about Bitcoin mining is that we're harming the grid and taking money from taxpayers.
Stop stealing our money.
The next one is, what is your most embarrassing story in your career?
You've got to have a good one.
Yeah, you've got to have a good one.
While he's thinking, at the end of this year, we should
a compilation.
Yes, and we should pick our top 3.
Yeah.
And give them a little shout out. We have the best embarrassing moment this year.
Most embarrassing
Congrats.
moment. Man, there's so many. I don't know where to start.
Tell us all of them.
Had you got me a few years ago, I used to really get my feelings hurt about getting my teeth kicked in by somebody, but I mean, the reality is now it's just so used to being wrong that it's it's just kind of all one blur.
Yeah.
Probably it's not really about Bitcoin. I would say it's Bitcoin involved. Maybe, saying something wrong in a foreign language that I don't know and making myself, I'll give you a good one. I was in China on my way to look at a friend's mine, and I was going through the Chinese TSA, and I kept going through the metal detector, and I was kept having stuff in my pocket. And I tried to say, sorry, I'm just an idiot. But what came out was, you should be sorry because you're an idiot. And so,
wait, did you say it in Chinese?
Yeah. And so it didn't sink in until I was past security, and they kept pulling me back, and then pulled me to the side and searched all my stuff. And I'm like,
because they were this guy.
What is going on? I was like, oh no, I said the wrong word. And so that one was pretty good. The whole flight was delayed because of that. And then of course, everybody was like, "You're the white dude that messed everything up." So that
because you were rude.
That's right. This imperialist foreigner making us late for our flight. That was a whole thing. That was a pretty good one. So yeah,
that's funny.
One. That's terrifying to me.
So don't say ni yobin. Say wo yobin. I'm dumb, not you're dumb.
How much Chinese do you speak?
I would say I'm marginally elementary at best.
I mean,
I'm good enough to, order food and get some,
right.
Directions, and, get a cab.
Yeah.
And,
I have my little 5-year-old neighbor teaching me Chinese.
Nice.
I know.
China's going to take over. I'm hype. Another discussion for another podcast someday.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. We will link your Twitter. You're a great follow. So.
Thanks.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially if people, like we were saying, really want to learn. I feel like you post a lot of good educational.
Yes. And he will be speaking at Empower. So
March 26th and 27th, 2024.
And if you don't come for the education, you can stay for the shit posting.
Yes.
Always a good time. All right. Catch you later.